Hello, everyone. This is YiFeng, and welcome
Hi,
to
YiFeng.
Watching Silent Films podcast, where we pick a movie every week, we watch it, and simply talk about it. That's the whole point and goal of this podcast. And today, I am happy to introduce to you Bob. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Bob.
Hi, YiFeng.
And of course, I want to...
Hi, Lily.
And thank you,
Hello.
Lily. And returning with us is my co-host, Lily.
Hello.
And,
hello.
Yeah, I want to introduce Bob today just to join us on this merry adventure. One of the things that I want to tell Bob about is that one of my missions for this particular type of podcast is to raise awareness for silent films.
Mm-hmm.
It is certainly a realm of movies that is not as popular as the other types of movies, even what we call the talkies, which is very popular out there, with color, with widescreen, and that's kind of the modern movies where people just like that. They tend to veer towards that. In fact, just recently, I was over a friend's house, and on Netflix, I actually searched for silent films. Guess what? There was only one. Like, literally,
Wow.
just one. I was like, Netflix is for all movies, right? Which is kind of hilarious because when Netflix first started as a streaming service in the early days, like when it first started, I did search for silent movies then too, and I saw like hundreds, at least hundreds, if not thousands. I don't know. I didn't count. So that goes to show you how the market, I think, has shifted quite dramatically. Silent films, it was already a niche before, but now even more so than before, because now you have streaming services like Criterion. I think they have their own Criterion channel, which is now, I think, part of under the umbrella of the Time Warner Corporation. Time Warner owns like HBO now, I think Comcast. I can't remember. There's all these big corporations, so they're all trying to come up with their own streaming service.
Right.
And right now, Criterion has their own, so that would be an illustration that, and of course the traditional disc distributions, like the DVDs, Blu-rays that many distribution houses have. Anyways, side notes. So today we are going to talk about Häxan. I think that's how you pronounce it. 1920.
Sounds right.
1920. Is it 22? 21? It took like a couple years.
22. Yeah, it took about a
work on
couple
it.
years.
Yeah, and then it's a Swedish/Danish production, I think, and it's directed by Benjamin Christensen. I think that's how the guy pronounced it when I was listening to the bonus tracks and stuff like that.
Wow.
So that's the movie feature that we're going to talk about today. But before we get rolling and getting into that, I do want to just introduce Bob, and I already introduced him, but tell us real quick your 5-second sort of background on what kind of film background do you have, in the sense that, like, what kind of things have you seen, and also things that you like more of, and what is one of your favorite silent films?
Okay. Well, let's say I'm 55 years old. I'm from the Boston area, and I like all kinds of films. Basically, from the beginning of the film industry. I don't have a particular love for silent films, but I like them as much as any other film. As far as favorite films, probably The Gold Rush is one of my favorite. I think Charlie Chaplin is amazing.
Excellent.
I like almost all of his films.
Oh, yes, we will get to those. We haven't even gotten to this yet. I don't think we've had one comedy yet so far.
No?
No, not yet. Now
Wow, that's funny.
Yes, that is very funny. So that's perfect. And Lily, you want to give a little bit of background, kind of a refresher for Bob and I guess the rest of the audience too? Sometimes we'll jump into these podcasts randomly, so I don't always know.
Like what I do? I don't know.
No, I'm just saying, like, what was the start of your interest in silent films, and what got you into it, and sort of your 5-second overview of like what Bob was just saying.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of interest you were in the silent film realm and all that stuff.
Yeah,
quick.
so So when I reached out to you, when I saw your ad on newenglandfilm.com, I was actually looking for more production assistant gigs for working in the film industry and working on student films. And I just happened to see your posts, and I was like, you know what, I'm actually really interested in that because I don't personally know a lot about silent films, and I'm trying to work in the business. So it'd be nice to have this kind of, this niche of also knowing, hey, besides working in film, I know a bit about the older generation of film too. And I reached out. I work at Audio Journal in Worcester. We're an online radio broadcast. So I was like, well, I'm already talking on the radio. Maybe I can do a podcast too. So hopefully it's working out.
Oh, yeah. No,
Excellent.
It's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant. And
So when did you answer that, Lily? How long ago?
Oh, my God. Was that July,
summer,
June?
yeah, sometime in the summer.
Oh, okay.
I figured somebody who was going to be interested in working in film might potentially be interested in the history of movies too, since it's very
that's
similar
great.
around.
Yep.
But I sort of did a blast to see whoever's interested, and then so my entry into silent films was very early on. When I was in my early 20s. I think, Bob, you probably heard some of this before, maybe, so I might be repeating myself. Sorry. To you, anyway.
That's okay.
That's okay.
In the early 20s, I was doing a lot of different things, but one of the things I really wanted to get into was I took a very brief intro to film class in high school, and I've always wanted to sit down and actually watch the movies. So I kept the book, actually, I had from high school. It was by Bruce Cowain. It's called A Short History of Movies. I think it's now in the 8th or 10th edition, or beyond that now, probably. That's the last few editions I had. And in the back of the index of the textbook, as it were, for these classes, there's the list of movies organized by era and also directors. So I literally started with the beginning of films like, Trip to the Moon, Great Train Robbery, blah, 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 and just kept going. Whoever directed this, like Chaplin, I've seen everything he's done that's available to me in the early 2000s. At that point, I was using Netflix with the disc thing, not the stream. So you could borrow, at that time you could borrow 8 discs out at a time. So that's what I did. I maxed it out. I wasn't doing just the 2 or 3. So I was just one thing after the other. And that really, I think that's all I could do. I watched as much as I could to cover all the silent film era. And that's pretty much it. I didn't even go into the talkies because at that point I was so overwhelmed. There's so many movies to watch, I couldn't possibly watch all of them. So my knowledge gap is actually from the talkies all the way, the 30s, all the way through probably want to say 70s and 80s. That's the largest gap of movies for myself.
Wow.
So modern movies and also the early era is kind of my jam, as it were. All right. So let's keep moving forward here. For the past week since the last podcast, either Lily or Bob, if you had a chance to check out anything in the classic realm. By classic realm, I usually mean prior to Star Wars.
Unfortunately,
line.
not.
That's okay. How about you, Bob? Did you have a chance?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I had. I also didn't have a chance, except I think I had briefly popped in a few discs of whatchamacallit. I recently got a. It's gonna sound like a broken record because for the last few podcasts I've been saying I recently got a 3D projector, but it's true. It's a nice fancy toy, and I also got a few 3D movies for it from the golden age or / silver age of the 3D film era. So it'd be stuff like It Came from Outer Space. That was in 3D, but it was filmed in 3D, like 2 cameras.
Mm-hmm.
So not the green and cyan thing, but the actual stereo, graphic. Anyways, they're all available on the Blu-ray in 3D, and they're all amazing. So I had a chance to check that out. And the Mad Magician, 1953 and 54 is the golden age, where almost every single one of those big hits had to be in 3D. But anyways,
I should mention. I mean, over the last couple of months, I've been watching Alfred Hitchcock films.
That's classic.
A series with my brother. Yeah,
absolutely. Any of them? I saw a blip where they're gonna try to release some early films of Hitchcock where he was either a production assistant I'll have to check that out and link it to you guys. But I saw on the release calendar that his earlier work, like even before The Black Lodger, which is one of his earliest works, like in the super early era in British cinema, he was doing a lot of stuff. And I forgot what it is now, but there's a bunch of titles I've never heard of before, even in the Hitchcock. Is it
very interesting?
So,
yeah,
anyways,
that sounds really good.
Yeah, it's due in December or something, so that'll be interesting to check out once it arrives. But anyway, so without further ado, let's dive into this movie, 1922, Häxan. And of course, it's spoiler-full, as it were, and because it's almost 100 years.
97 years old, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost 100 years, so if you haven't seen it by now, I don't know what to tell you. Just kidding. It was actually not very widely available. So anyway, so
horror movies are not my genre. In general, I don't like horror movies, but this isn't really a horror movie.
No,
it's not really like a documentary.
Sort of, yes, absolutely. That's actually one of the key things. So, what was your first impression upon just when you first finished the movie? What was the one thought that popped up and said, what was your one reaction right away? Right after you finished it.
Informative.
Very good. Lily?
Funny. It's really bad.
That's excellent.
I was actually pretty creeped out by it. I mean, it wasn't that the film was particularly scary. It was pretty comical, especially the imagery of the devil sticking his tongue out all the time.
Oh my gosh, that was so that was so really funny.
But
I was dying.
But the scenes of torture and punishment it really freaked me out. It was like, wow, like I couldn't believe people were watching this in 1922.
Wow.
But it is Swedish. It is not. It wasn't for American audiences, which is why there was actually nudity in it, which is another shocker to me.
Well, there was. This is all pre-Hays Code. In the Hays Code era, that's when things got clamped down, especially in the United States, where most of the film output was. But prior to World War II, in the around the 1940s, most of the European cinema was pretty well advanced. Mm-hmm. And after the war, of course, all of the film industries got destroyed, so they had to kind of start over. Prior to that, right. Especially people like the German film industry was very, very strong, and so was the Danish and Dutch as well. Like they're all kind of progressing at astonishingly the same rate as the counterparts everywhere in the world, essentially. That's one of the things that we covered in the earlier podcast, where it's always been amazing to me that even though you've got this French filmmaker, they're doing very similar things to the American one, which is doing very similar things to the Chinese one, which is doing very similar things to the German one. They're all they're all not in the same country, in the same locale, they're capable of innovating in very much the same ways. And it's actually one of the things I love about silent films is just their ability to, to pull something out of the hat. They say that the necessity is the mother of invention, or how's that go?
Necessity is the mother of invention. You said it correctly.
So I don't always know the phrases correctly, so I'll have to spit it out and then see if you guys can pick up on if it's true or not.
And I find it interesting. What you seem to be pointing out is that film, and I always said this, transcends cultures.
Absolutely. But also the way they innovate is amazing. Just the fact that somebody could, do close-ups and do a lot of the silhouettes, like in this movie, which is the same as what the Germans are doing. Is the same as what a lot of the earlier, even Griffith, the American ones, are just the way they're framing the movie.
Film noir before noir was a thing.
Well, this is way before that, of course. So
exactly.
These are all fathers or grandfathers of noir, and that would eventually inform all of those filmmakers much later. down the road. In fact, this is before Joan of the Arc, which is one of the most famous silent films of all time. Not exactly the same theme, but very similar themes, right? Of a person who is accused of something, but then goes through this incredible, torturous episode. And the way that the face is shown in a close-up was kind of shocking, even for the audiences back then. Which film itself was almost like witchcraft. Like the very act of showing movies with the big close-up of a person's face. Because remember, back then, people were used to just the stage, which means that even on the stage, you were still removed from the person. But the fact that a film camera can blow a person's head up, 50 foot or whatever it is, that creeped a lot of people out. And
I remember, early films, if they, when they had the train coming at the screen for effect, the audience all ducked.
Right.
Because they weren't used to such things. So seeing someone's face right on the screen in their face,
it's very unusual.
Imagine really would freak people out.
Yeah, it's and some people got very philosophical, even with this particular movie, in the sense that they didn't want. It's almost like you're peering into somebody's soul somehow, that you're recording that there, because back then they were the study of sort of the mysticism. To them, wasn't too far-fetched from reality. Like, even though this movie talked about Middle Ages, the reality was around the 20s. People still lived like it was the Middle Ages in some way, shape, or form, because of how much has advanced, even from 1922 to all the way to now, almost 100 years later. How much more, and even at a accelerated pace. What's the word? Exponential rate of knowledge that we have. Like the whole notion that the witchcraft people had hysteria, which is a totally out-of-date medical term now. That doesn't really exist in the way that he was portraying in the movie. You know what I mean? Like, so even his knowledge of what was supposedly modern then is now totally out of date. So it's almost like the studies and research he did was like witchcraft unto itself. The whole movie it just turned out funny that way. But so my take from the movie was, I've never seen this movie. A lot of these silent film movies that we're picking through usually I've seen usually, but some of these I haven't seen. This is one of those I haven't seen, and I've heard of. It's one of the masterpieces of the silent film era for sure, and certainly this director. Masterpiece for sure. He's done about probably a handful, 10 plus movies. Unfortunately, most of which is lost. Maybe one of them is around on YouTube, Mysterious X or something like that, and maybe others, where he continues to innovate with some of those techniques of silhouettes and close-ups and light and shadow and all that stuff. But so my takeaway from this is that it's kind of it has so much similarity to F for Fake by Orson Welles. If you guys ever heard of or seen that,
no.
So Orson Welles, is the wonderkin for Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane,
is
War of the Worlds.
Yeah, sure, the radio realm, yes, absolutely. But and he also conquered the stage where he did Othello by casting all black actors.
Right.
So he was a genius, wonderkin talent in the creative arts, and but later on in his years, towards his death, essentially, he made a few movies. One of which is called F for Fake, which essentially the topic of which is talking about what is reality when it comes to film, like. And kind of the whole notion, not exactly what we think of fake news nowadays, but more just the notion of what is real. Like, is it just your perception of the truth is the truth? Or is it just like, is reality separate from your perception of what the truth is? Anyways, it's a very fascinating look, that movie, F for Fake, about what reality and truth is.
Right.
In the realm, in the way that Orson Welles perceives reality. And that's kind of how I view this movie, Häxan, because it is this person, Benjamin Christensen's, his take on his treatise, really, on what essentially is wrong with the world then, and also what is wrong with the world then, being Middle Ages when he was making the movie, but also then around the 20s when he was making the movie in his current time, because he tried to really make a link of back in the Middle Ages, these witches were burned at the stake for wrong reasons. Like they really didn't, weren't practicing witchcraft. A big percentage of them were just falsely accusing one another, and they all, got taken away. And and because of kind of just pointing fingers, it's the kind of the mass hysteria or the sort of the mob mentality of, the
Salem witch trials.
Yep.
Yeah, which came from the Europe. It swept
Right.
over from Europe, and certainly in that realm, that's kind of what he was talking about. But he also relayed that to the modern era of his time, of like where people would be shamed to have some sort of medical conditions or sort of they could have symptoms of something that could be cured or could be, it's not
Right.
treated or cured, but people in society are shaming these people because they have the ailments. That's
Exactly, which they didn't understand.
yeah, and that's really my takeaway of the movie was astonishing for a 1922 movie, is that beyond all the imagery, beyond the kind of what we now is kind of like silliness and all that stuff, that's kind of the motif and the theme of the movie.
That's the thing. That's the element of the movie that freaked me out.
Right.
Was that he really touched very well on the fear of something that's different being something satanic.
Right.
And that people were literally being killed for it. And not only that, more horrible than that is that they were being questioned and, what's the word I'm looking for? Induced to give the answer that they wanted to hear, regardless of how much they resisted. They broke them.
Yeah, during the interrogation.
They interrogated them to break them,
Right.
which is, it is pretty horrifying.
But even if you take it to modern day, that's still kind of, in some
Exactly.
ways, especially like if you look at not the whole movement, but certain parts of the whole Black Lives Matter thing,
Yep.
where you've got cops and they snatch up, black people thinking, oh, these guys did the crime. In fact, the police themselves have some sort of bias, right? They just think that
Exactly.
anybody black is doing this. And during the, like, Central Park 5 is a perfect example where these kids are just playing around. I don't know if you know that case, but you can Google around.
I do.
Lily, do you know about that one?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's a case essentially where the kids were snatched up by the cops thinking they committed some other crime, but they're just black kids. And they're basically have been convinced through the, similar to the witch trial in the Häxan movie, like, you did this, and if you confess, you'll get less of a sentence.
Yeah, they were pre-convicted.
So like, even now, I feel like that's kind of the link, as it were, to modern day from that movie till now is kind of the message
Sure.
that this filmmaker was trying to make a point of, that you could be falsely accused of something that you didn't do, and you could be tried and convicted even based on that, in whatever court of opinion, as it were, that was on there.
No real court.
Right. So what do you think of that, Lily?
I agree with everything. This movie made me, very aware of what we teach in Salem. So, Bob, I'm an actor, and I do historical reenactments of, like, the Puritan monologues from the witch trial. So, of course, I do my research. So, seeing this film, and getting that feedback, back to myself, comparing Salem to Europe, it's just, everything is so similar. So I just agree with everything. Is what we were talking about before. They alluded everything to Satan because they felt like, oh, if you're a good person, why would this bad thing happen to you? It basically, one example was, this guy, John, he's walking down the road, he trips and falls, he breaks his ankle. Oh, well, they would believe that was the power of Satan. why would something bad happen to him? Otherwise, he did something wrong. It was that's how they thought. Even though he just tripped. He did it to himself. Oh, no, that was Satan's work. Someone must have bewitched him to do that. And that's when they would start pointing fingers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is just funny that historically, from like what was it, like the 1600s, 1700s, all the way to the 1800s, for a period of a couple hundred years, there seemed to be this massive sweep across, the Western world, I guess, maybe, of all of these accusations that ended up with a lot of innocent people burnt at the stake. A lot of which can be for political reasons too, beyond that, or just, it's just stuff like that. Although, since then, they have distributed a number. The $8 million people was a little bit overestimated. There was this one statistician who was basically taking a guesstimate, and it wasn't really based on any fact. So it's probably closer to something like, not that it lessens the problem. That's not saying that it's not a big problem, but it wasn't like 8 million people big. It was something like, hundreds of thousands or something like that. It was like 40,000 people or something, or a couple 100,000. I can't remember the figures now. But if you check out the Criterion edition, the commentary points out, and also some of the text or pamphlet that came with it does point that out too. Is that the figure is a little bit overestimated, but also on top of that, the research that Benjamin Christensen, the director, who also played the devil, Satan, in the movie.
Okay.
He's the same guy, but he also played Jesus in one brief few seconds. So he was both Jesus and Satan. This is quite interesting.
Not many people have that in their credits. The movies they've done.
Yeah. I think he thought that was kind of funny. So
Sure.
This is one of the most expensive productions ever in the history of Swedish/Dutch cinema.
No
Up
kidding.
to that point, they spent a huge amount of money because he's had success before that. He had a few movies before this, and he was very popular in terms of theater.
It shows. I mean, in the first 10 to 15 minutes, that was one of the things I said to myself: "Is wow, the production quality on this is outstanding."
Oh, I spent a huge amount of money up to that time.
I mean, for 1922, I said this is really good quality.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
And on that note too, I was amazed that he had a lot of scenes in straight black and white, but he obviously used a red filter for certain scenes and a blue filter for certain
the
scenes.
tinting. Exactly.
The tinting to break up the monotony of the black and white. I thought that was very clever.
Well, that tinting was common. Lily knows about this because we talked about it to death before.
Yeah.
But it's
that was a regular.
Yeah, from
method.
the 1910s all the way through the 20s. What a filmmaker would often do is take scenes like if it's nighttime, usually it would be bluish, darkish blue, and when they tint things, they would actually take the film negative and color it in manually. So you have a team of hundreds of people coloring every cell, every frame of every copy of the movie. So imagine if you're doing a single print that's 1,000 foot long, whatever it is. But now you got to make copies for international audiences. You got to make copies for every city, right? So every single print, every single frame has to be physically, manually colored in.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So anyways, that's a very common thing back then for highlighting themes. Like daytime would be gold or something, or happier times, and red is whatever that color symbolizes, and a more generic common term is what they do intend to have the colors be in there. So this is a very common thing for silent movies.
I felt like this film did it more dramatically and or maybe more obviously than a film such as The Gold Rush.
Yes. I don't remember if there was
Gold Rush. I don't remember noticing it. I remember noticing it in this. It stuck out to me.
I can't remember because it's been a long, long time since I've seen Gold Rush. If there was tinting in that, but the tinting usually is intentional. When they're restoring silent films like this, usually they'll take note of that and say they usually try to look at the original notes from the filmmakers And if they have a research backing up that the tinting ought to be done, they'll follow those notes and allow those tinting to kind of remain, I guess,
Gotcha.
to restore it. But in some situations, like Kino is a house that will often respect that if there was no notes to be found, they'll simply leave it in black and white. But actually, if you look at the nitrate itself, you can actually see that the tinting was inside there. They just didn't want to make a decisions on what color it is because they don't have those notes. But tinting has always been like this desire to have sound and color was always there in the silent film in the beginning. Like they've always had desire to have sound and colors. So when those things finally caught up, they were happy. A lot of filmmakers were. But anyways, so go ahead.
You were mentioning the cost of the film at the time. Do you happen to have an equivalent calculation of how much that would be in today's market?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't do the translation conversion to the modern times. But
I was just curious.
The next big one might be I can't remember now. I just read it the other day, but there's many big productions. Probably Ben-Hur would probably be the next one. The silent version of Ben-Hur, not the
the original Ben-Hur.
Yeah. So the interesting part, just going scene by scene, was in the very beginning when that lady was trying to look for the love potion, I guess.
Right.
The pious man wasn't that attractive to begin with.
No.
So I was like,
no.
He was
why would you
really
want to love potion
pouring his
for
drink
that?
all over himself, and
That's kind
he
of
must
the
have
comedy.
stunk like awful.
Yeah, that's part of the comedy. I think it was trying to.
Well, I guess people back then weren't that choosy.
Especially in the Middle Ages, right?
Right.
The other thing of note that I found interesting is the different sources of the materials, especially the imagery of sort of the devil and sort of the apocalyptic nature of things. I felt it was kind of out of a lot of the... Have you heard of the Bosch paintings in the Renaissance era?
I've heard of them. I'm not familiar
So
with them.
basically, it's one of those artists from the Renaissance era and all the way from the 15th, 16th century, all the way to 17th, 18th, where they paint. This guy tends to be focused. He is one of many artists. He's not the only one, but he's his most well known.
Right. Yep.
To paint like a animal head, like a pig head, on top of a devil, and pitchfork stabbing gore. It's very gory, usually, and it depicts this insane sort of depiction of hell and the kind of very gothic,
complicated paintings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this movie reminds me a lot of those influences, which has ties. I think there's some ties to that book and resources that Benjamin Kaisen tried to do. In fact, the reason. So go ahead.
Is it possible that some of the imagery of the Renaissance paintings you're talking about were actually used in the film? No,
because that's the next thing I was going to talk about. Is that the way that this director, he was before he made this movie, he made a few movies that were very popular. He was trying to look at the look at the next piece of work that he was trying to do, and he couldn't really find it except in a bookstore one day. He found this copy of sort of witchcraft and the history of the witchcraft throughout the ages. Essentially, it's kind of a subtitle, and I think it was Melius or something. I forgot the title of it. It was one of the many books that he was researching. He really got into it, and he thought it was so palatable, and that he really wanted to do more research into it. And so, in his mind, what he wanted to do is write a screenplay, and then have the literary people back his research up, like the actual sort of middle age historians would actually know about those details to actually back up his screenplay and research, and none of them would. He would ask around all the universities and higher eds, and nobody would. They're just like, "What is this?" Because film at that point was so new that people didn't know what it was. And so they were kind of maybe not afraid of it, just didn't really care for it. And so asking around all these historians are like, "Hey, can you back my research up?" And they're like, "No, I don't want to do that." at the end of the day, what happened was he ended up doing the research himself. So he actually, in the movie, it referenced that in the program that you have, it says that you have, you can reference a movie program, which is a physical print if you go to the theater watching this movie. And it actually cited something like 50, 60 sources of primary research he did for this movie. So it wasn't something that was just like based on a single book. The single book was a jumping off point, which led to multiple searches. But in modern eyes, I forgot. There's a couple of guys who, a few years ago in 2011, or during their college thesis days, they watched this movie and they were really fascinated by the primary research that the director did. So they actually sought those original resources out and actually did their own research. So they basically double-checked this director's original primary research. It turns out all of the research that this director did was based on what's called spiritual type research. Like all the sources he used wasn't 100% like historically accurate fact-wise. But then the problem was that was as much as he could get his hands on. There was no Google, there was no internet, and the academia of back then was quite limited. And the fact that a lot of them wouldn't sort of help him do it, and so he was kind of this amateur researcher, and he did as best as he could. But a lot of research he did was based on that. So as much as it is kind of accurate, there's a lot of gray area and a lot of assumptions he did. And so in 2011, they published this like fat book, they call it, the big fat book of this movie, making of this movie, and it talked about a lot of those things. Kind of deconstruct some of the mythology that he dove into, you know what I mean? And so most of it is fairly accurate, except there's lots of leaps, especially when it comes to Hysteria, the medical part. Because since then, we've obviously have advanced a lot medically, you know what I mean?
True.
But so that was the big thing, was that the research that he did was good, but like for then, but not for now, because a lot of it turned out to be not quite accurate, just by the virtue of time and also exponential increase of knowledge. One of the witches later on was Maria Weaver, that homeless lady that got accused of being a witchcraft, which was apparently very common. A lot of her shots, a close-up of her head, was like Joan of Arc. If you remember seeing Joan of Arc, the movie. It was basically this person suffering and a lot of people in tears. A lot of people crying everywhere. That sort of motif and that imagery was very striking, I would say. Definitely. When they reviewed Joan of Arc, some of the reviewers were like, well, this Benjamin Christensen already did it 10 years ago in Häxan. Some of them wrote a review like that, basically. But so what's the one sort of shot that really stood out for you guys in this movie? One imagery or shot or something.
All right. Go ahead, Lily.
Probably just the way that they drowned the witches.
Right.
Even though they weren't witches. Because there weren't any witches at all, ever. Just mainly the imagery of how they showed the woman being, her arms and legs being tied to her hands being tied to her ankles. And the adage was, if she floats, she's a witch. But if she sinks, God bless her soul, basically. That's how it was.
That's a no-win scenario.
No-win scenario.
I think...
Ugh. No, you can go.
I think for me I think the scene that stood out the most was, the woman who was coerced to give a confession talked about the coven going in one by one and kissing the devil's butt.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, oh my goodness, 1922, and they have this scene that's really, like, I cannot believe that I'm watching this.
Yeah. Absolutely. For me, it's probably the baby cooking. I was like, huh. I mean, it probably wasn't a real baby, but still, it was like, that's quite interesting, even for today, to watch a movie where they're like, let's throw the baby and cook it.
I have to say also that the scene, right off the start, the scene you already mentioned where the woman was looking for the love potion, right before that, they brought in a corpse. She cut off the finger.
Oh, yeah, the thief.
And sniffed it of the thief. And she was like, they didn't take this corpse down in time. And she uses it to make a potion. And I'm like, oh, this is horrible.
Yep. Any of those.
I think another part making one of the potions was they said part of the love potion was, I don't know, cat feces, and I was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
That's that's disgusting and awful. How is that love? Yeah, here's some love.
Yeah, the guy tasted it, thought it tasted funny, but all of a sudden he wanted her.
That's crazy.
This tastes weird, but wow, she looks good.
But I did like a lot of the imagery they used in the very beginning too. But I was making cracks at the images myself because there's like the first devil. He's got a staff. He's walking. I'm just like, hey, he's going to work. And then the horned devil showing a book to a pastor, a priest, and I'm just like, he's looking for directions. And then
Mystery
I don't know.
Science
I think
3000, right?
Mystery Science 3000. And then the other woman looking astray, and she's like, "Oh no, oh dear," as the devil turns scratching his butt. It's just like, okay, whatever. But yeah, the people's beliefs in the devil were so strong that they saw him everywhere. I think that's mentioned right in the movie as well. I was like, yep, that was true.
Yeah. There was a one scene where first the silhouette thing was very striking. There are many scenes where like the torture chamber, essentially where all the I guess they're priests. They're congregating and they're about to torture these people, and there's a lot of spokes and wheels and stuff that's in the foreground, and it's silhouetted, and then there's the background of. That's the thing about these movies. These are one of the many movies like we just recently reviewed, where many of these movies we just saw, they had a lot of background and foreground activity like at the same time. There's just always this contrast of tons of stuff happening in the ground, background, ton of stuff happening in the foreground. And then more so in this movie than the other scene that really popped out at me was the witch flying scene, where there's a ton of witches, and then there's this flying all over the place, and then there's the silhouette. And so they shot all those plates separately. Like you talk about special effects, that's what they were doing back then, where like they shot all of those separately. So they had a plate of the silhouette, they had a plate of. They built a massive miniature or bigature or whatever you call it, a spinning thing of the city. It's all fake because they couldn't. Even at that time, they no longer had a town that looked like ancient Middle Ages. They had to build it from scratch, like miniatures, and they would build it in a large wheel and would spin the wheel so it looked like you were flying. The scenery was flying by you, and then for the witches, they would film each witch individually, and the camera would move, the witch wouldn't move. So the witch is stationary, and the camera would sweep from the left to right to create the illusion that the witch was actually flying. And at the end, composite everything into a single shot. So that's like, you talk about special effects.
Early special effects, right?
Yeah, and we're doing that even in A Trip to the Moon. I mean, they were doing that in the late 1800s, 1895, 1898. We've seen many of those, Lillian and I anyway. So it's like not new. It's only 20 plus years beyond, and they're still using that technique, which is pretty amazing. But like even today, the computer visual effects, there's not much different. I mean, they got green screen, but it's still a plate. You shoot a plate, you can composite it all together. Right? Not much has changed. Except for the technology computer, But other than that, the technique itself hasn't really changed.
Yep.
Yeah. That's really interesting, though, about the composites. And something else I liked about this movie was just the special effects makeup that they used, especially on Benjamin Christensen, Swedish.
Well, all of them, yeah?
Yeah.
All
just
of those
everything
fantastic
for the devils.
scenes, yeah.
Yeah.
And the costumes and set design, and also, like, there was a very brief stop motion animation of the devil breaking through a door. If you noticed that.
Oh yeah, that was a little weird.
Yeah,
that was kind of
like,
creepy.
But that's stop animation. That wasn't live action or anything. That was like we saw stop animation back in the 1903s. There was a short clip of that, but it's evolved now, I think. So they put a little bit of that in there too in this movie. Mm-hmm. That's pretty cool.
Let's see. But
with the wonder how much the technology, what you were saying, the moving town on the large wheel, whether they used that for the tornado scene in The Wizard of Oz when the witch was outside the window, flying by on a broom.
Yeah, I haven't really studied that, but that's at least another decade down the road, I think, right? 1936. What was it?
39.
39. So that's another. Yep. That's almost close to another 20 years down the road already.
Yeah.
And by then, so much more advancement has taken place. So,
right.
That's much later. Yeah.
But it's funny because they have. It doesn't look. It's in color and all, but it's not that much more sophisticated when you see the cow, which is obviously just standing in a field flying by in the tornado.
Right.
And it obviously you'd say,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they did it, but it wouldn't surprise me if they have very similar tactics.
I'm just saying that in this film, he stayed to the witches, things that were flying, which in a way is better than a movie that was done almost 20 years later.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing surprising about silent films is that there are many silent films where they pioneered, but also did all of these special effects so well that it's like, wow, like they were already doing that then prior to sound.
Yep.
And that by the time sound comes along, if anything, it would be an evolution or improvement even more, building on top of what has already been achieved, by the silent film era.
And going back to the quality as well, I mean, the quality, the thing that was another part of the horror of it was, I don't know how they made the people look so much like they had like almost sharpened teeth when they smiled.
All right.
I mean, yeah, there's black paint and everything, but usually you can see that clearly. And it looked to me like they picked people that had really bad teeth to do these scenes.
Yeah, it's probably not an accident when you see stuff like that. There are a lot of things. Those things are very much intentional. Right. So, at the end of this movie, what do you think about the whole thesis, I guess, or the conclusion, or the point he was trying to make at the end about hysteria and all that? So, what do you think about that whole last portion, the last part?
I thought it was kind of sad that the woman knew that she had something wrong, and she was attributing it to almost being basically like being possessed,
right?
Because she didn't feel in control. But the doctor was very dismissive of it and said, well, it wasn't a doctor; it was like
he's a monk or something.
A chemist or something. Yeah, he was very dismissive, and he said, "Look, I'm going to ignore what you've said. Just don't come back to my shop."
Oh, you're talking about the woman who tried to steal the jewelry, right? Like it's the scene where in the jewelry shop. So he's the jewelry shop owner.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
right, yeah.
So he lets her go, but
right.
She's saying
she was like a kleptomania. And then he was
yeah.
It's because of this hysteria. And he was like, sure, I'll let you go.
Right. But he ended it by saying so many people still said, the devil made me do it.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
So this craziness tied in, basically it's a form of insanity tied in with this superstition.
Right.
what they see as superstition anyway.
Yeah.
Jury's still out on that one.
Yeah, certainly. In modern days, there's a if you look up Hysteria now, sort of referencing modern times, it really no longer a term. In the 1980s, they said they changed that hysterical neurosis to conversion disorder.
No kidding.
Yeah. So.
No kidding.
It's basically patients who have neurological issues that potentially could be a psychological trigger. Like it's not like a physical thing, but if your brain thinks that it could be, then it can potentially manifest itself physically, which is the thing that the movie talks about, where it's like, the person thinks that they can't feel anything on their back,
right,
with the needles, right. So they test it all, and he's like, I can't feel anything. So that's the current term for it anyway. It's called conversion disorder, or CD, or functional neurological symptom disorder.
And I just think it's funny that it starts off, well, not funny, I mean interesting is a better word, that it starts off talking about witchcraft in the Middle Ages, and it ends with psychology.
Right. Something medical.
Right.
Yeah. That's the tie, I think, it wants to try to make. So, do you think that it was a convincing argument at the end of the day with this movie's premise? If it was
yes.
an argument,
I think it was. I think it was very well done. I think it makes a very good statement about the ignorance of the Middle Ages and how we've come a long way into seeing what was true or what they believed.
And how about you, Lily?
I would have to agree with that as well. Everything that was said in the movie, I was kind of nodding my head along to it, just pointing, people pointing fingers at each other, trying to alleviate their, their stress and their anxiety about being captured as, a quote unquote witch. And that's just how it spread so far and wide. What else? Yeah, just the hysteria, just everything because of it is bad. I don't know. My brain's not working right now.
It's okay. It's an interesting term, this term, because it originates from a Greek word for uterus, which has it's not totally an ancient word, but it has a lot to do with
women,
sort of women and all that stuff, and which is the whole thing about witches, right? It seems to be in the studies, especially in these books that's referencing, at least that big fat book that they were researching about the background of this movie, they tend to sort of bring some of this up, which is, I didn't read the whole book, I just saw blips, synopsis and bits and pieces of it. And one of the things that it talks about is the whole hysteria notion of like only women is, affected by this because of the and there's all these kind of sexist presuppositions that it can only be right, and the whole notion, and it all ties into this and that. And so when the film was released, in places that had deeply entrenched with Catholic churches or churches of all kinds, they were an uproar. They were like, this is clearly something against the church, and they're really they certainly made a big stink about it, and so it prevented this movie from being more popular than it could have been, I think, in the time that it was released. And it made a lot of cuts. They wanted the censors. There was no Hays Code censor, but they had sort of the mom mentality public censor, basically saying you can't release based on this. So they ended up cutting a lot of stuff out.
Yeah.
Which, at the end of the day, through history, they preserved some prints that had all this uncut elements, which is now the cuts you're seeing now.
You might have to beep my next comment out, but I thought it was shocking and yet funny that at the end, because I was watching a translation at the bottom, but I was watching it with the Swedish wording in the center, and the end was slut.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, what?
Yep. There's certainly a lot of Freudian type elements because by then he's already been very popular in the popular consciousness of the era, and so there are many elements even of this movie that had certainly ties to all those things as well. So yeah, so that's kind of the conclusion that it's a classic masterpiece in what determines what is a documentary, or is it a fictional movie, or is it a movie that presents itself as a documentary but then has seeming like reenactments through it. Some reviewers said it's almost like in modern day anyways, like if you watch History Channel, there's the universe. Well, you can't really show the universe. You have to dramatize some of it. So some of the History Channel specials will often dramatize past events. So I think that's kind of the category this falls into.
I agree. Is
like it talks about history, but it has to dramatize some of it to show you to illustrate the perspective it's trying to go at.
There's no continuous story through the thing.
Yeah, like it's disjointed, right? So you got this love potion thing, and then later on you got this Maria. What was her name? Maria Weaver, I guess, is the character's name. Who was like this homeless person that this family tried to feed and take in, but then ended up accusing. And there was this element of like, if you sweep a witch off their feet, they don't have power, which is why they put them in these carts. Literally put the bag over their head and sweep them off their feet to get rid of their witchcraftery powers.
Yeah, there's a lot of just no, like what they believed in back then. It just was. But it's all has to do with their education, and that's of course. If you're not educated, obviously you believe everything.
Right.
Yeah, and I found it interesting that at that time period, even in that time in the 20s, there's still this element of believing in that sort of thing it's still kind of real and like living and walking amongst you, like that kind of supernatural power.
No, it's still, even now.
Well, of course now, but I'm talking about then. There's this. It's less so now, especially in the United States, because there's this overwhelming notion that science and stuff like that. But back then, that part was only starting out, and there are schools of thoughts where we're still sort of, there's this mysticism that they feel like potentially happened, especially like what was that movie? I can't remember now. One of the Nolan movies about magician. What was that called?
The Magician?
No.
The Illusionist?
No, that's the other one. The one.
Oh, the
how was it called?
Prestige?
Yes, Prestige. There we go. Sorry. So in the movie Prestige, and same thing with the Illusionist too, but like it was the era of time. It was coming out of Victorian era, and it's entering into the modern age, where they did magic with the sleight of hand tricks, but they had this incredible notion to try to believe in this, like supernatural could still like in reality happen in real life. And I think like one of the movies we saw in the past, one of the shorts I think, had a person that was believing in that school of thought. I think I forgot what that was. There was a short, remember Lily in the beginning?
Trying to think, was it the man who was having putting his heads on the table? Was it that one?
Oh, I can't remember now. It's got to be one of those.
I feel like it's an Edison one.
Maybe it is, yeah. But there was a particular artist in there who was trying to demonstrate. I think it might have been the Santa Claus one, maybe. But anyways, the point is, it was this person who was using film to illustrate his belief. There's a particular school, a literal school, where they were teaching all these things, these spiritual realm things, and there was like, I subscribe to this, and this is real, and you have less of that today, I think, compared to the times back then, where they would have this sort of itch, I guess, to try to believe in that, So, anyway, that's my take on it. Is that it is a interesting documentary / dramatization of a piece of communication that this artist really wants you to know, and he spent a good couple of years of his life trying to work on it and try to convince you.
And it is, in my opinion, that is worth seeing for anyone who likes silent films.
Oh yeah, well, certainly one of the tops. It's and people do try to relate this to the German expressionists, except that when Lily and I watch some of those other ones, the expressionistic movement tends to actually paint the shadows physically on the sets, so it's a little bit different. So German expression has its own style and attributes tied to it that it's not exactly the same, even though it does play with light and shadow a lot. That's kind of as much as you can get to it. But the thing about this particular one is more like a Renaissance painting in some of the scenes. Not all of them. And there's this tableau, and we had used this term before, but in Renaissance painting, there's the notion of the chiaroscuro, which in art is like the trying to paint shadows in paintings, especially when you have clothing draped on a person, and the painting tries to draw the shadows of the clothes as it falls on the person as the light hits it. And so that's kind of the texture that you see in these movies here, especially this one, in some of the scenes where the clothes are ruffling and then you've got shadows just dancing all over the clothes, and it's definitely some of that at play in the light and shadows. But anyway,
I'd have to be watching for it.
Yeah, it's very common apparently with the artists of this. They all kind of cross influence one another. I think once they've seen one, they try to one up one another. All right, folks. Any lasting parting thoughts before we wrap this up? Any last words?
Let me see. One thing from one of the intertitle cards that I liked, I put it as one of my top part of my note, was, whenever man comes across something incomprehensible, the result is always sorcery and evil spirits. And I just wanted to comment on that was definitely how it was in the Middle Ages. Everything was alluded to the mysticism, as we were saying. So this, once again, this Christensen did an excellent job at portraying how it was back then with the dramatizations. Because just alluding back to the Salem witchcraft trials too, I was just nodding my head in recognition of this is what happened in America, and this happened before in Europe. We didn't burn anyone in America, but we hanged a lot of people for witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that when you take a topic, and I think the person who made this film did this, you accentuate, you kind of blow it up a bit, because, I mean, the number of people that died, and it wasn't that widespread. There were places where it was worse than others. But I think that when you focus on it, you can make it seem like it was much more widespread than it was.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that it might have been, I feel like it was an exaggeration when I heard that line, like everything was alluded to as, witchcraft. I'm sure there were a lot more reasonable voices, but it didn't seem like it when the subject matter is what is being focused on. I don't know if that made a lot of sense. I didn't say that well, but
yeah, that makes sense. It's essentially just
you get tunnel vision when it's the subject of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because Salem was an exceptional example. But certainly in very conservative areas, people would be afraid of witchcraft, sure. But I don't think people were going around accusing people of witchcraft everywhere.
I think it depends on what the context is, because there are certain places where there's this sort of mob mentality was taking over, and it was certain pockets. I wonder if it's because the clergymen kind of roused the mobs to do that, maybe?
Absolutely. I'm sure that had a big influence in a lot of areas.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so certain pockets, and certainly like our Salem, there's certain pockets of that puritanical sort of locations where this could potentially happen. But
I guess in relation to the film, I would just say I would have a bone of contention with I feel like there's some exaggeration on making it seem like, because it works for the film to make people realize, there was this, there was a widespread fear of Satanism and witchcraft and everything, but I think that the film makes it seem probably far worse than it was.
Yeah, well, you remember, like I mentioned, that the Criterion materials did say that a lot of the sources based on is not exactly, 100% fact, especially the 2011 edition of fact checking. Looking back, anyways, because we also know more. There's more depth of knowledge we have now compared to then even when he was doing it.
Yes.
But regardless, I think I think we all agreed that this movie is a great take on just the whole notion of misrepresenting, like somebody accusing somebody of doing something they didn't do, and that part I feel like this director did a very stellar job of doing that, presenting and communicating. So it's kind of my parting thoughts is that it's kind of like that. It's a very well done piece of communication. I feel like I've only scratched the surface too, just my own view, and I feel like it'll take me...
Of the subject matter or the film?
The movie and the subject matter it has inspired. I don't know if I'll have time, but I almost makes me wish when I take that book out and actually read it. Almost. I don't know if I'm gonna have time to read it, but that's the thing I joke with Julie about is like if. Like in silent movies, if you're watching it, it's fine, but then you cross the line if you start reading books. So like in the beginning, there was this Kevin Brownlow book. It's called what's it called again?
The Parade Goes By.
As the Parade Goes By, that's right. It was referencing a movie, and the silent film star he was interviewing said, "Yeah, this era's over. We're dying. Is like the parade going by," or something like that, and that's how the title came along. And he interviewed he had primary research, hand-to-hand, face-to-face interview with people like Buster Keaton, Chaplin, the works, like all these big giants of, because they were still alive in the 60s when he wrote the book.
So there's a book called As the Parade Goes By.
Yeah, it's one of the big fat books, they call it. It's about 700, 800 pages. What's great about it, it really zooms in on... anyways, I read that book and I was like, oh man, I've crossed that line. from just the amateur armchair critic into like person who's reading books about it. That's the line I thought I would never cross, but apparently
diving
I have.
Deep, yeah.
And I don't want to cross more, but apparently I might have to take this book out. I'm trying to read this.
Deeper into the woods.
I know, just into the what's it called, the rabbit hole, as it were.
Yep,
which I just read recently too, Alice in Wonderland.
Oh.
And it's related to silent films because there was a few silent films about Alice and Alice in Wonderland, which we may or may not get to because most of silent movies are lost. 90% is lost. Wow. And so it's astonishing. Like this director, Benjamin Kreissensen, he made probably over 10 features, and only this one, which is good because it's one of his best, and also I think Mysterious X is on YouTube, but other than that, it's in bits and pieces. Some of these other films, people just didn't preserve it. They just like it melted down for nitrate, or if a movie's been remade, they'll say the newer one's better.
Yeah,
because they don't want the old one lying around. Like Wizard of Oz, they made a black and white silent movie version. I don't know if you know that.
No.
Yeah, they made one, and when the new one came out, they're like, "Oh, don't watch that one. I'll watch the new one. It's got color and sound." Right? Newer and better, always. Okay, so that can essentially be our week for this particular...
It's nice to be here, guys. Thank you for having me aboard.
Yes, thank you very much for signing on and helping us review and tackle this quite complicated topic as the first movie for you.
Invite me back.
Yeah. And Lily, thank you very much again for hopping on and spending a very long day, I'm sure, for you, at the end of a long day for you. And,
it is all good. Thank you.
Yes. So, and for the listeners, thank you very much for listening to us. And as always, we always highly recommend that you leave a comment or feedback or review on Apple Podcasts and wherever you are getting this podcast from, whichever platform you're from, and or you're downloading or listening this from. And if you leave a comment, it actually allows other enthusiasts and people who are interested in silent films to find us in a more optimized and better way, more efficient way. And to find sort of the past archives of all of our podcasts, please visit watchingsilentfilms.com. Sorry, I messed that up. Let me try again. It's like amateur hour today. watchingsilentfilmsplural.wordpress.com. Again, that's watchingsilentfilmsplural.wordpress.com. And there you'll find all of our past archives. And thank you again, everyone. Thanks for listeners. And thank you, Bob and Lily. And we'll chat again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you later.